Hello guys, welcome back. I'm Eloise. If it's your first time tuning in, welcome to my perfume channel. So today I want to talk about a fragrance that I added to my collection at the end of the summer. As fall was approaching, I was looking for fragrances that would be cozy and that would be appropriate for the fall into the winter. And specifically, this fragrance is a tobacco-centered fragrance. I was looking for a tobacco fragrance that I could use and that I would enjoy. Up to that point, I only had one tobacco fragrance that I ever owned, and that is Tom Ford's Tobacco Vanille, and I barely even ever use this, so it's about 80% full. And I just heard recently that if the bottom is written in the gold writing, that this is the older formulation, which sounds about accurate because I got this a very long time ago. I'm not sure what it is. I'm not necessarily in love with this, but maybe I should revisit. In any case, I was looking for something new, something different, and I ended up buying Andy Tauer's Sundowner, which is a tobacco fragrance. I got it back in September, and I've worn it, but I put it back in the box for purposes of today's video. But in any case, the fragrance comes in the blue box like this, slides up, and there is a card that says, "Enjoy, Andy Tauer." So does he sign these, like each card? If he does, that's really nice. And here's the fragrance. And I guess the design is all about the sun, given that it's called Sundowner. And I like the idea of the name Sundowner. It just made the fact that I purchased the fragrance as a fall winter fragrance even more appropriate. And I'm really happy with this purchase. So this is a 50 ml bottle. I think they all come in 50 ml sizes. I'm not sure. And I see that it retails for about $175 US. To be honest, I got it for a bit less. So I guess I got it for a pretty good deal. This fragrance was launched in 2021, so it's not as older as some of the other ones. I actually just received this morning the other Andy Tauer that I now own. And this is number 2, L'air de désert marocain. And I was comparing this one with Au Cœur du Désert, which is the extrait version, and the heavier, supposed to be more long-lasting version of this with similar notes. And I ended up going with this one in the end, and I'm really, really happy. So back to Sundowner. I jotted down a little blurb from the official website, and it says, "Surrender to the darkness of the night with a boozy cocktail and a good dose of velvety, smoky happiness with the last sun on your cheeks." So I guess it's all about having a drink and a smoke as the sun goes down, hence the name Sundowner. And I think unlike some of the other fragrances from Andy Tauer, like L'air de désert marocain, which is inspired by the Moroccan desert, I think this one is inspired by the Nile. The drink and the cigar and having a smoke at sundown takes place in the Nile, according to the website. So let's talk about what Sundowner smells like. I will say the magic, in my opinion, of this fragrance is in the dry down. So it opens up with this earthy, chocolatey patchouli that's also a little smoky, and I detect something boozy right in the opening. The tobacco is not quite prominent in that moment. At first spray, this is really strong. And the way I see this fragrance in comparison to other fragrances, I mean, obviously some fragrances we consider more linear, and some, like the amouages, develop in layers and are more complex and take you on a journey. This one I would not describe as a linear fragrance. Not as complex as some of the amouages that I'm thinking of, at least. So while I don't think this is super complex, I find it really interesting the way I experience the fragrance. And the best way that I could describe it is that I feel that all of the notes in the note breakdown for this fragrance are all coming out at once. It's all thrown out there at once upon first spray. And then they're all like emanating as it develops, and you're getting the different aspects of the fragrance. But I feel like it's all there at once. And so that's why in the opening, I mean, this is to my nose. This is how, I'm not saying that this is the way the fragrance was constructed. I'm not a perfumer. This is just the way I experience this. It's something a little different to me in comparison to other fragrances. That I know for sure. So where you would think that you would experience patchouli as a base note or a background note, in this case, I feel like everything comes out at once, and so you get this blast of patchouli that's so earthy. It reminds me of the patchouli in Psychedelique by Javoy, that very strong, chocolatey, earthy patchouli that I personally associate with soil, like wet dirt soil, not in a bad way. There's something boozy about this at the same time, and that could be coming from the patchouli itself, the chocolatey facet, I'm not sure. And it quickly starts to change. I think a lot happens in the first 5 minutes of spraying the fragrance. Within 5 minutes, it quickly gets smoother. That rough opening, which could be rough and strong and really in your face, it very quickly gets pretty smooth. And I start to get cocoa, not the chocolatey aspect of the patchouli, but an actually note of cocoa, a very dark cocoa. You know how when you buy chocolate, if you like dark chocolate, I love dark chocolate, there are different percentages of the cacao concentration, or the different levels of cacao in the chocolate, and it gets more bitter the higher the concentration. Well, the cacao in here is absolutely very dark, 75%, 80%, and it comes off like a dusty, like a cacao powder, like a cocoa powder, but very dark. And the tobacco starts to come through. But the tobacco is always smooth, which really surprised me about the fragrance. This fragrance turned out to be much more feminine than I was anticipating, much more smooth than I was imagining. And I don't mean to say feminine, I mean much more unisex. I thought this was going to be a rough tobacco that I might have a hard time wearing, but this is actually a very delicate, in my opinion, a very delicate, smooth, natural tobacco with ambery touches and this warm sweetness. So after the cacao starts to come through, I also get the tobacco and I get a warm sweetness. There's a sweetness that starts to come through, and it almost feels, to my nose, in consistency and even in the smell, I feel like it gives me the impression of honey. I feel like there's something a little gooey and sticky and rich, like a honey component to the fragrance that provides a little warm sweetness. But that could be from tonka beans, because I think the sweetness in here is clearly not a sweetness from any kind of like synthetic vanilla. It's more of an ambery, warm sweetness that I imagine comes from tonka beans. I don't know if tonka beans is listed as a note. I can't even remember. By the way, all the notes I made when I first tested this were without knowing the notes in the fragrance, which I like doing sometimes. And I then did go and I looked up the notes. And it's interesting that on the Andy Tower, on the official website, there are some notes listed, and it says that it makes up more than 30% of the fragrance. And those notes are tobacco absolute, cacao absolute, patchouli essence oil, rose absolute, and orange peel oil. And other than those notes, there's nothing else listed on the official website. But if you go to Fragrantica, there are all sorts of, I think there are additions to those notes, like citrus at the top. I don't get any citrus at the top here. Like I said, to me, this opens up with this blast of earthy, dusty, cocoa-like patchouli that's a little smoky, and then I start to get the tobacco. So within these first 5 minutes, when the tobacco is apparent and you have a little sweetness, it's warm, it almost feels like honey. Then I get this little floral component to the fragrance that I feel gives this brightness. I feel like in these 5 minutes, something happens where the fragrance like opens up, like something that blooms. And I get this little twinkle of brightness from the floral component. Doesn't take over the fragrance, obviously, it's not a floral fragrance, but I absolutely get a little bit of floral together with that warm sweetness with the tobacco and the cacao. So after the initial 5-10 minutes, this turns into a very, very smooth, almost a little powdery, dry, dusty tobacco fragrance with a tobacco that smells really natural and smooth and ambery with this tonka bean sweetness and this honey-like component in consistency. And I imagine something a little golden sweetening the composition here, and this little brightness from this floral note, which I guess is the rose oil, rose absolute. It's really, really an enjoyable fragrance. And again, it's much smoother than I expected. Yeah, I get the patchouli. It's like right in your face. It's so chocolatey and earthy. And then it gets smoky. You detect that it's a tobacco that's coming through. There's a little sweetness, never gets too sweet. It's really nice. So I didn't really watch any reviews on this, but I did see something at some point. It may have been in a list of tobacco fragrances. Someone referred to this as being a little animalic, and I will say that I personally do not detect any animalic notes in here. It definitely has the common theme that the Andy Tower fragrances have. So I've only smelled 3 of the fragrances. This one, and L'air de dessert marocain, and a cure de dessert. And I will say that there is definitely a common thread. They're very dry and dusty, and this one is no exception. It is a very dry fragrance, but at the same time, it's really, really smooth, and it's warm, and it's spicy. I think this is a very smooth tobacco fragrance that I'm really enjoying. And I did spray Tobacco Vanille on this earlier. And it's such a different tobacco fragrance. The sweetness in Tobacco Vanille is definitely more vanillic, a little more synthetic. Tobacco Vanille is definitely more of a perfumey tobacco fragrance. The tobacco is burning in Tobacco Vanille. I'm not sure if it comes from incense. I don't even remember the notes for that fragrance, but it smells like a burning tobacco. The tobacco in Sundowner, to me, smells like a very smooth, very natural tobacco. It's not overwhelming, and it's totally unisex. There's nothing that's not unisex about the fragrance, in my opinion. And like I said at the beginning of the video, the magic happens in the dry down. It's this smooth, ambery, warm, spiced tobacco that has this brightness from the rose, and the sweetness is so warm, and it's spicy, and the tobacco is so smooth. So it really does dry down to a very nice, smooth fragrance, and it's not rough at all, especially in comparison to the opening, which I think can be a little rough. In terms of longevity, this was on my skin. I wore it to work several times. It was on my skin for 7-8 hours. I could smell it on myself. It's not a hugely projecting fragrance, so it wasn't bothering anyone else around me, but I could smell it on myself. I was wearing it last night as well. I haven't left my house in a week, so I've been testing fragrances, and I had this on myself last night, and I kept getting whiffs of it coming off of my arm. And it's really enjoyable if you're going to wear a fragrance that you can at least enjoy it yourself. I'm not looking for a beast mode fragrance that everyone else needs necessarily to smell, but if I can enjoy it on myself and I can smell it on myself throughout the day, I'm happy. So I think the performance is great. I think this is great for the fall and winter as the temperature drops, which it is here in New York. It's a very cozy and warm, spicy fragrance. I think it's so smooth and appropriate for the colder season. So I'm enjoying it, and I'm glad that I got a bottle of this. So this is Sundowner by Andy Tower. I think it's worth getting your nose on if you haven't smelled this and you're interested in a tobacco fragrance. This is a nice option. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've tried Sundowner or any other of the Andy Tower fragrances. I'm curious to know your experience with the fragrance and whether you've tried it or haven't tried this. So until next time, bye guys.